I sprint left as the horn keeps blaring. My boots slap through mud that sucks at every stride. The black pine tree line spits torchlight out at the wall like a wound bleeding orange. 300 riders. Maybe more than that. Honestly, I stopped counting past the first 200. They pour down the slope toward the palisade in a loose, confident mass. It is the lazy confidence of men who have done this exact thing to 100 other towns and walked away rich every time. One eye. One notorious grin, visible even at this distance because the man wears it like a badge. One banner stitched crooked, a dripping red blade sewn on with a drunk man's hand. Bloodblade Baron rides out front of all of them. He is probably already counting the girls and the grain he thinks he is about to own. He looks at plank walls and torchlight and his brain files the whole town under one word: soft. He is about to learn the difference between a town and a business, and the lesson is going to be expensive for him specifically. The first wave hits the outer field at a dead charge. Then the ground opens under them. Screams come first, sharp and short. After the screams comes the wet crunch of men and horses folding down into the trench. They land on stakes I had driven and sharpened 2 weeks ago on a hunch. That hunch just paid for itself in about 4 seconds flat. Torches go out in the pit all at once, dozens of them, like someone snuffed 100 candles in a single breath. I watch from the second rampart. What I feel is close to the satisfaction of watching a bad debt finally get collected. Every bandit thrashing in that trench is a customer who tried to walk out of my town without paying his tab. The charge behind the first wave stumbles into the wreckage of the first. Horses rear. Men pile into each other in the dark, and that confusion is exactly when Old Wolf's line opens up. Gareth stands on the rampart with a torch in one hand and a spear in the other. He does not waste breath on speeches about honor, because he knows his men do not need honor tonight. He tells his 500 flat and plain that retreat means their wives go hungry by winter. He tells them their children go back to begging on frozen roads. He tells them every hut I built for them gets handed straight to a bandit's saddlebag if this line breaks. Then he adds the number that actually moves men. A dead bandit is worth 2 silver coins on the spot, paid personal, no waiting on payroll. I did not write that speech for him. I did not need to. Gareth learned my language faster than any tutor could have taught it to him. He speaks it now like a native. 6 months ago he was starving in a ditch, and today he commands men who would rather die on this wall than go back to being nothing. The Iron Guard was built from farmers and beggars, from a very large number of people who had nothing to lose, right up until I gave them something worth losing. Now they fight like they know exactly what that something is worth. Arrows come off the rampart in ragged, uneven volleys. There is more enthusiasm in those volleys than form. Enthusiasm is doing just fine tonight, so I let it work. Down near the granary line, Pete is not using form either. Pete has a woodcutting axe and zero interest in technique. He plants himself directly between 3 armed raiders and the iron cauldrons that fed him his first hot meal in a year. He puts one man down with a swing that has no business connecting cleanly, and it connects anyway. He drags the axe free of body and turns on the next raider like the cauldrons behind him are his own children. In a sense they are. That porridge is the only thing standing between Pete and the ghost of who he used to be. He is not letting anyone near it tonight. I watch him cave in a shield with his bare shoulder, the metal buckling under the weight of a man who has decided this ground is non-negotiable. Somewhere underneath the adrenaline I think that loyalty bought with food is the cheapest and sturdiest loyalty there is. Idealists quit when the math turns against them. Fed men do not. The bandits in the second wave slow their horses. Then they stop. Then they start backing the animals up instead of pushing them forward, and I watch the exact moment the math changes behind their eyes. This was supposed to be a soft farming town, a fence, a few prayers, and evening's work. Instead there is a trench full of their friends drowning in mud and stakes. There is a wall full of men fighting like their lives are actually worth defending. There is a giant with an axe treating a soup pot like a shrine nobody is allowed to touch. Bloodblade Baron sees all of it too, the whole shape of the disaster he rode into. He wheels his horse around. Even at this distance I can read the shape of the order coming out of him. Pull back, regroup, live to rob somebody easier next month. Not on my ledger. I have cavalry staged behind the eastern rise for exactly this moment, and I give the signal before his retreat finishes forming into an actual plan. We come around the flank at a gallop. We cut the road he wants to run down. We close the gap between his panic and his escape route before he can measure it. I ride at the front of that charge, because a business owner should be present for the moments that actually matter. I also want him to see my face when the bill comes due. I give one order across the field, loud enough for my own men to hear it over the horses and the screaming. No survivors except the leader. People might hear an order like that and mistake it for mercy, for restraint, for some flicker of a heart buried under the arithmetic. It is not that. It is inventory control, nothing softer than that. Every bandit who dies out here tonight is one less variable threatening the 6,000-some heads of population currently generating silver for me on a daily, compounding basis. I want that variable removed completely. I want it removed permanently, and I want it removed with extreme prejudice. The rage sitting in my chest is not for the men themselves, or for the smoke, or for the screaming around me. It is for the fact that somebody looked at my citizens and thought about taking them off my books without paying me first. That is the kind of insult that does not get forgiven, not by me, not tonight, not ever. My cavalry crashes into the collapsing bandit line. The fighting turns from a battle into something closer to a harvest. Blades rise. Blades fall. Horses scream in the dark, a sound I will probably hear again in my sleep. The mud goes from black to something darker still. The torches scattered across the field gutter out one by one, like a candle shop closing up for the night, shutter by shutter. I keep my eyes on the eastern road the entire time. That road is the only door Bloodblade Baron has left open to him, and I intend to make sure it stays shut. A rider tries to break past me on my right side, and I put him down myself. No hesitation, because every second I spend hesitating is a second closer to losing a paying subject to some panicked man's blade. Somewhere past midnight the shape of the fight changes again. It is no longer a raid. It is not even a retreat anymore. It is a collapse. Bandits throwing weapons down into the mud, bandits running in circles inside a ring my men have already closed around them. By 4 in the morning it is over. The field between the tree line and the wall looks like something a butcher would refuse to clean up, even for good money. We count 260 dead where they fell. That number is give or take a few the trench swallowed whole and never gave back. Roughly 30 are still breathing. 30 more decisions I get to make before sunrise, and I already know I will enjoy at least one of them. My men drag the survivors into the town square in a line. They do it exactly the way I trained them to back when we talked through how to handle repeat offenders in this line of work. Hamstrung so none of them get any clever ideas about running twice. Staked to the ground so the whole town can see precisely what it costs to try robbing this address. Bloodblade Baron is staked out front and center, one eye tracking the crowd gathering around him. He looks like a man only now doing the math on how badly he miscalculated this entire evening. 6,000 plus residents come out of their homes in the gray pre-dawn light. They come to look at the men who tried to burn their town down around them while they slept. There is no fear in that crowd, not the kind I expected to see. There is only the kind of cold, quiet fury that comes from people who have finally been given permission to stop being afraid. Old Wolf finds me near the square. He gives his report standing straight, voice steady, the way a man reports numbers he does not want to say out loud but says anyway. 15 Iron Guards dead. 8 wounded, and some of those wounds bad enough that they may never walk right again. I keep my face doing the respectful, grieving commander thing. That is what the moment calls for, and Gareth and every guard standing near him would notice in a heartbeat if it slipped even a fraction. Inside, though, the number lands very differently. 15 dead is 15 silver coins gone from my daily total. Gone every single day, forever, which stacks up over a single year to something in the neighborhood of 5,000 silver I will simply never see. That is not a casualty count to me, not in this first ugly heartbeat of processing it. That is a permanent cut to my income. It makes my jaw tighten harder than the sight of the blood on the ground does, and I hate that fact about myself even as it happens. I walk the line of wounded anyway. Appearances matter, and I remind myself of that with every step. But buried under the accounting, some smaller, quieter part of me actually is glad these particular men are still breathing at all. I tell each of them, personally, one at a time, that the town remembers what they did tonight. I tell them their families will be provided for. I tell them Greywood does not forget the people who bleed for it. I mean it more than I would like to admit to myself. I still hate the number. Both things are true at once, and I do not have time right now to sort out which one is more honest. Bloodblade Baron watches all of this unfold from his stake in the square. When I finally walk over to him, he starts talking fast, the way men do when they have run out of every other option available to them. He offers ransom. More gold than this whole town has seen in a decade, he says, buried somewhere in the hills, mine to take if I let him walk free. He offers hidden caches, old raid halls, names of other camps. Anything at all he thinks might be worth more to me than his own death. I crouch down so we are closer to Isla. I let him finish, because it costs me nothing to listen, and because I want to enjoy this part more than I probably should. Then I tell him, plainly, that his buried gold is a one-time payment. One-time payments do not interest me anymore, I tell him, not at this stage of my life. I tell him that the 6,000 plus people he tried to slaughter tonight are worth 1 silver coin each. Every single day. For as long as they live under my protection, and that number is going to keep growing every year I am alive to collect it. I tell him his treasure is a puddle and my citizens are a river. Only a very stupid man tries to sell someone a puddle when the river is already flowing past his door. He does not have a response to that. Which is fine, because I was never planning on a negotiation in the first place. I stand. I draw my blade. I finish it myself, because an owner should be willing to do his own collections when the debt in question is this personal. The square goes quiet in that specific way a crowd goes quiet after it has just watched something it needed to see. Then I turn to face them. I tell them, loud enough to carry to the back rows, that anyone who comes for Greywood comes for me personally. I tell them what happened to Bloodblade Baron tonight is the standing rate for that particular mistake. I tell them my protection is not a favor. It is a promise. It does not lapse, and it does not get renegotiated by anyone carrying a torch and bad intentions. The cheer that goes up is not the polite kind. It is the kind that comes from people who spent years assuming nobody was ever going to stand between them and men like Bloodblade Baron. They just found out they were wrong about that, and the sound of it rolls across the square like something physical. They call me their protector, their lord, their savior. I let them, because it is true in effect even if the ledger running in my head is burning on entirely different fuel than theirs. I built the trench to protect an income stream. I trained the guard to protect an income stream. The income stream just happens to be 6,000 living, breathing people, and protecting them properly is apparently indistinguishable from loving them, at least from where they are standing. I can live with that confusion, whatever it says about me. Dawn comes up gray, then gold. Right at 6 in the morning the familiar chime rolls through my skull, the one that means the system has finished its nightly bookkeeping. Population, 6,285. Daily income, 6,285 silver, deposited automatically, already sitting in my account like it always does regardless of what happened the night before. 1 citizen, 1 silver coin every single day, no matter how bloody the night before was. I stare at that number longer than usual. It means the town survived intact enough that the count barely moved at all. Watching the system calmly process a payment right after a massacre is the strangest kind of reassurance I have ever felt in my life. The world almost ended 6 hours ago, and my accounting did not even blink at it. Bal finds me while I am still turning that number over in my head. Clipboard in hand, ledger under his arm, he asks the practical question that somebody has to ask eventually. What do we do with the 30 prisoners? Execute them as a warning, the way we did their leader, or keep them staked in the square a while longer so every farmer and merchant in Greywood gets a good long look at what happens to men who raid this town. Both options sit on the table, and honestly both would work fine as a message. But somewhere underneath the tactical answer, a different question starts forming. It has nothing to do with warnings and everything to do with math. I ask myself whether the system that counts my citizens counts everyone equally. Or whether it only counts free people. Or whether, and this is the part that makes my pulse pick up, it might also count anyone legally registered as property. Slaves. If a slave gets logged into the town registry the same way a free citizen does the system see a person, or does it see a name on a page? There is one way to find out, and I do not feel like waiting around for theory when I have got 30 test subjects staked out in the square already. I have one of the prisoners dragged over to the registration table, hands still bound behind him. I have ball pressed the man's thumb into ink and then down onto a blank parchment. It is the same parchment we use for every new arrival who wants a hut and a ration card and a place on my books. The bandit does not understand what is happening to him, which is fine by me, because I am not registering him as a citizen. I am registering him as a slave, permanently on paper, with his thumbprint standing in as the seal. Then I wait to see if the universe cares about the distinction between free and owned. It does not take long to find out. The chime hits again, softer this time, almost polite about announcing itself. Population 6,286. One number, ticking up by exactly one, the instant that thumbprint dried on the page. I have to stop myself from grinning in front of the crowd. What that chime just told me is worth more than anything Bloodblade Baron tried to bribe me with an hour ago. Slaves count. Every prisoner, every captive, every enemy I ever managed to chain instead of kill is not a cost sitting dead weight on my ledger, waiting to be fed for nothing in return. Every single one of them is a silver coin a day, forever, the exact same rate as a free farmer or a shopkeeper or a soldier standing the wall. The only difference is that a slave costs almost nothing to keep alive. A bowl of gruel and a roof that leaks is a lot cheaper than wages, and it still pays the same daily coin into my account. Something settles into place in my head, cold and very satisfied. It is the specific feeling of finding a loophole nobody else at the table has noticed yet. I turn back to the square, to Baal, to the 30 men staked out in the mud waiting to hear whether they live or die. I give them a speech. I tell them about the mercy of the God of Light, about how compassion separates a true lord from a common butcher. I tell them that even men who tried to burn a town to the ground deserve a chance to atone through labor rather than lose their lives outright. It is a good speech. I almost believe it myself while I am saying it out loud. Then I lay out the terms of that mercy. They will spend what remains of their lives behind a fenced quarry on the edge of town, breaking stone from sunrise to dark. Fed just enough to keep working. Whipped the moment anyone decides working is optional today. Bale writes it all down without comment. But I catch the look on his face, the one he gets when he is trying to work out whether the man he serves is generous, or simply running a very long con dressed up as generosity. He is not entirely wrong to wonder about that. I have the quarry crew marched out toward the fence line as the sun finishes climbing over the pines. 30 new entries in my registry. 30 new silver coins a day that used to be a raiding party and are now, as of this morning, a labor force. I stand at the edge of the square looking out at them. I look at the stakes still driven into the mud, at the smoke still climbing off the field beyond the wall. I already know this is not a one-time trick I stumbled into by accident. Every enemy I capture from now on is not a problem to be buried. It is a hire. I never used to think about pig iron as a philosophy. Yet here I am staring at a wagon shipment of the ugly stuff. Something in my chest hums like a struck bell. The metal is dull and pitted, unglamorous by any measure. It does not shine, it does not ring pretty, it does not look like anything worth a second glance. Any idiot with gold buys finished tools. That is retail thinking. Retail thinking is how you die poor. I have died once already, so I pay attention to the lesson. I imported blacksmiths instead of tools. 6 of them, contracts signed, travel costs eaten out of my own pocket. I bought raw pig iron by the wagon load for a fraction of what hammered tools would have cost me on the open market. Manufacturing margin stays in my pocket that way. It does not bleed out to some merchant guild 3 towns over. The smiths set up under canvas roofs at the edge of town. Within days the ringing of hammers became the new background music of Greywood. A rhythm, under every conversation, whether anyone wanted it there or not. Even the dogs in the square stopped flinching at the noise after the second morning. I stood there watching sparks fly off the anvils. Orange arcs dying in the dirt before they finished falling. Each strike sounded like a small argument being settled in favor of iron. I did the math in my head over and over. The math never stopped being satisfying. Every axe head that came off that forge was a unit of productivity I did not have yet. Multiplying in front of my eyes like interest compounding on a ledger I could not stop reading. I could watch that compounding happen and never grow tired of it. Roughly 2,000 tools rolled out to the serfs over the following days. Axes, shovels, pickaxe. Real iron, not the splintered wood and flint garbage they had been scraping by with for years. Wagon after wagon emptied into waiting hands. The pile at the depot never seemed to shrink fast enough for the crowd around it. You would have thought I was handing out royal titles instead of farm equipment. In most of this world, an iron tool is not a tool. It is a family legacy. Something a father hands to a son with more ceremony than his own wedding ring ever got. I watched an old woman hold a shovel the way you would hold a newborn. Both arms under it, eyes wet. Her fingers traced the join where handle met blade like she was checking it was real. I had to look away before the accounting part of my brain got uncomfortable with how good that felt to watch. Old Wolf was the one who sold me on the investment for good. I found him out past the eastern fields 3 days after the distribution. The change in him was the kind of number that does not lie to you. Wooden hose break under real weight. Stone axes glance off roots and bounce back at your shins. I had the bruises of other men's stories to prove it, secondhand as those bruises were. Iron does not care about roots. Iron goes through. His output had roughly tripled, by his own rough count and by mine. I do not trust much in this world, but I trust arithmetic. Multiply that across every household that received a tool. I was not looking at an act of generosity. I was looking at a productivity engine I had bought at wholesale price. Stuart Ball did not see it that way. Not at first, not even close. He came to me with the ledger already open. His finger jammed against the total like it was a wound that would not close. He walked me through the damage. Near 500 gold spent, all told, on smiths, on iron, on the whole operation. His face did the thing faces do when a number feels like a personal betrayal. I let him finish. I always let the worried ones finish. Interrupting them only means you have to sit through the same speech twice. Then I asked him what his plan was for the first hard frost. When the roads north lock solid and no grain caravan can reach us, even if I wanted to pay for one. He did not have an answer. There was not one to have. Buying our way through winter was never on the table to begin with. It was a fantasy dressed up as a line item in a budget. Self-sufficiency was the only real plan on offer. And self-sufficiency needs tools before it needs anything else at all. Housing that does not leak. Farmland clawed back from weeds. Clawed back from however many bad years this barony suffered before I arrived to claim it. Winter wheat in the ground before the frost takes the soil. Greenhouses standing before the first snow falls, not scrambled together after. 2 weeks. That was the window I gave the whole plan. Said out loud, in front of witnesses, so nobody could pretend later that I had not said it. Ball wrote it all down like a man taking dictation from his own execution order. His hand shook a little on the first line. It steadied by the third. But he wrote it down, every word, and that is the part that mattered. In my head, the number that actually counted was not the 500 gold spent. It was the over 6,000 silver coming in, every single morning. Like clockwork, like the world itself had signed a standing order with my name on it. 500 gold sounds like a wound until you remember I make that back in about a week without lifting a finger. Spending money to make the income permanent is not a cost. It is a subscription renewal, nothing more dramatic than that. I was still turning that thought over pleasantly, rolling it like a coin between 2 fingers. Then the runner came sprinting in with news that made me sit up straight. A caravan had pulled up outside town. Slavers. An outfit calling itself Black Crow. My first honest reaction, before any of the performative lord nonsense, before the mercy speeches and the public restraint I would need to perform in an hour, was something close to hunger. Every slave in that caravan was a body that could work, eat, live inside my walls. Eventually get counted by whatever cosmic ledger keeps paying me for population. Money trees. Walking, breathing money trees. Somebody had gone and parked a whole grove of them at my gate. I went down myself. A lord who delegates his asset acquisition is a lord who deserves to get cheated. I have no intention of being cheated by anyone. The caravan smelled the way a caravan smells. Sweat, rust, unwashed rope. It caught in the back of my throat before I even reached the wagons. The stock, lined up in a row with wrists bound, told its own story before a single mouth opened. I walked the line slow, the way you would walk a stockyard, hands behind my back. I kept my pace even, the same length of stride for each pair of eyes that followed me. I was not gentle about it in my head, even while my face stayed arranged into something polite. That one's ribs showed through skin gone the color of old paper. Rejected. He would be dead before my next payout cycle, and a dead asset returns nothing to anyone. That one's leg would not hold weight without a visible shake in it. Rejected. Bad investment, whatever sentimental nonsense might try to argue otherwise. I rejected more than half the line. I registered nothing about it worth mentioning. Dwelling on it would not have kept a single one of them alive 1 hour longer. The trader, a greasy sort with rings on fingers that had clearly never done a day of honest labor, watched me reject his merchandise like he was losing coin from my opinions alone. He shifted from foot to foot each time I shook my head. Then a certain glint came into his eye. The kind merchants get right before they try to upsell you on something you never asked for. He said he had one more. A special case, kept off to the side, not meant for the general block. He brought her out from behind the wagon the way a man unveils something shameful. Given how this world treats anything it does not understand, he probably believed that was exactly what he was doing. Half-elf. Younger than I expected. Dirt on her hands that looked less like neglect and more like habit. Hands that had spent years in soil on purpose, not by accident. I found myself looking at those hands longer than I looked at her face. The trader told her story with the relish of a man who enjoys watching other people fall from a height. She had been an academic once. Some title got stripped from her along with her freedom. All because she published a paper on farming methods the Church of Light decided was blasphemous. Composting. Human waste, animal waste, worked back into the soil to double crop yield. Every noble in earshot who overheard the story recoiled. Like she had confessed to devil worship right there in the mud. I heard the words double crop yield and stopped listening to anything else the man said. The rest of his sentence turned to noise behind my ears. I know things this world does not know I know. Knowledge that has no business living inside Lorien Bohunia's skull, and yet here it is more useful than anything else I own. Composting is not blasphemy. It is chemistry. It is the difference between a harvest that feeds a town and one that does not. The trader named a price meant to sound outrageous, a way of daring me to refuse. 1,000 silver, 10 gold. More than triple what I would have paid for the strongest laborer standing in that whole line. I paid it without blinking. I watched the trader's face try to work out what he had just missed. Merchants always assume overpaying means you got fooled, never that you saw something they could not. His grin faltered somewhere in the middle of counting the coin. I named her Chief Agricultural Officer of Greywood Town on the spot. Right there in the mud outside the caravan, before she had eaten a single meal. She did not thank me. She looked at me like a woman already calculating exits, weighing distances and doors. That evening she came to find me herself. The nerve behind that told me something before she said a single word. She stood in the doorway of the hall with her shoulders squared. Braced like she expected to have to fight her way back out. I understood exactly what she thought this conversation was going to be about. So I told her flatly, no dressing it up. I have no interest in her body. None. What I bought was her mind, her research, her hands in soil. Nothing else, and I said so plainly. The tension went out of her stance in stages. Like she did not fully believe me yet and was testing the statement by degrees. Waiting to see if I would contradict myself 2 minutes later. I did not contradict myself. I moved straight to business. Business is the only language I am fluent in. Apparently it is also the only language that reassures people faster than kindness ever does. I asked her directly whether her methods, given the resources of an entire barony behind them, could produce a real harvest before winter closed the roads. She studied me the way you study someone you expect to disappoint you on purpose. Out of habit rather than malice. Then she named a number designed to end the conversation before it started. Hundreds of gold, she said. Reciting it like the amount of some fine she already expected me to refuse to pay. I understood the shape of that number right away. It was not a budget. It was a test. The kind a woman laughed out of academic halls learns to run on every new authority figure before she lets herself hope again. I told her to be at the square at 6 in the morning if she wanted her answer instead of my word for it. She showed up early, arms crossed, unconvinced. Watching the eastern sky lighten over the rooftops like she expected nothing from it. At 6 exactly, the air around the square did what it does every single morning. Coin began pouring into existence out of nothing, stacking itself into glittering columns that had not existed a heartbeat before. Thousands of silver rising in neat towers. Population count ticking upward in the light like a second sunrise. 6,352 souls now paying dividends just by living inside my walls. Ella's arms uncrossed on their own, slow, like her body decided before her mind caught up. Her mouth opened, and nothing came out of it for a long stretch. I watched every assumption she had built about a poor exiled baron scrambling to hold a backwater together collapse in real time. In its place came a far more accurate picture of what she was actually looking at. I did not gloat. Gloating is for people who need the validation. I have never needed anyone's validation but my own ledger's. I told her the budget was unlimited and asked her to start. I named her Minister of Agriculture formally, in front of the gathering crowd, voice pitched to Quarry. Something ignited behind her eyes that had nothing to do with money. Everything to do with finally being believed after years of not being. She swore herself to my service right there, voice steady now. The voice of someone who has waited years for a room that would not burn her research for saying it out loud. It took her exactly 1 day to put that unlimited budget to use. The use she chose nearly started a riot. She ordered every household with a working set of hands to begin hauling composted waste, human and animal both, out across 2,000 acres of freshly reclaimed farmland. Old Wolf, of all people my most reliable convert, was the one who led the resistance. He stood in front of the pile with his new iron shovel hanging useless at his side. He told anyone who would listen that spreading filth on holy ground would curse the whole harvest. The others backed him fast, crossing themselves in whatever gesture passes for warding off evil in this world. Refusing to touch cart or shovel, I went out to the field myself. A lord who will not stand next to the thing he ordered built has no right to order it built in the first place. The smell hit me like a physical wall. It came in layers. Old rot underneath, sharper ammonia riding on top. The kind of stink that gets behind the eyes before it reaches the nose. I made myself stand in it anyway. Authority you will not personally pay for is only noise. My eyes watered and I let them. Then I did what I do best. I lied beautifully. I declared the compost pile sacred soil of harvest. A gift sent down by the god of light himself to bless the fields of a territory under his favor. I said it with my chin up and my hands open. The exact posture I have seen priests use. I hold no belief in any god of this world worth mentioning. But the serfs do, and borrowed conviction spends just as well as real conviction when you are the one writing the sermon. That bought me a few hesitant nods. A handful of shovels lifted an inch off the ground. Hesitant nods do not move 2,000 acres of manure though. Not by themselves. So I added the part that actually works on people. Every people in every world I have ever heard of. Extra meat rations for every household that hauls its share. Copper coin bonus per cart delivered to the field. The shift in the crowd was immediate, almost comic to watch unfold. Old Wolf, prophet of divine filth 5 minutes earlier, was first in line for a shovel. He was already calculating how many carts his sons could manage before sundown. By noon the field had turned into something closer to a competition than a corps. Serfs raced each other cart for cart, laughing about it, placing side bets on who would fill the most loads before dark. Someone started keeping score on a fence post with a piece of charcoal. Religious horror evaporated the instant there was meat and coins sitting on the other side of the scale. I found Ella at the edge of the field afterward, watching the carts roll past with an expression somewhere between fascination and disbelief. I told her the truth as plainly as I had told her about her body the night before. Faith fails where self-interest succeeds, every time in every field I have ever run. She'd not argue with that. She only kept watching the carts, quiet, and I could see her rewriting, piece by piece, everything she thought she understood about how to move people. I woke Kyle first, or rather Kyle woke himself. That's the way a man surfaces when his shoulder is screaming from yesterday's rock hauling. His brain hadn't caught up to the pain yet, but his body had already decided to sit upright. Scarface Kyle, they called him back when he ran with the bandits. The name came from a knife some farmer's wife put across his cheek during a raid that went sideways. Now he swings a pickaxe in my quarry. If I asked him, he'd probably tell you he expects to die there within the year. Cold does that to a man's math. It strips away whatever hope a person carries and leaves only the numbers underneath. He wasn't wrong to expect it either, statistically speaking. Quarry work under most lords kills its workforce on a rolling basis. I know that number because I looked at it before I decided to buy the man in the first place. An asset that dies before it pays back its acquisition cost is a bad investment, plain as that. So when the temperature dropped hard enough to crack the puddles by the barracks, I sent word down. The slave crews were getting a second hot ration. Meat, broth, bread, the works. I want to be clear about my reasoning here, because I think people assume too much virtue where none exists. I did not do this because the cold looked uncomfortable on their faces. I did it because a slave who collapses from exposure stops producing stone. A dead slave produces nothing at all except a hole I now have to refill with silver. Maintenance costs. That's the whole ledger entry. But Kyle didn't know any of that. He stood in line with his bowl out, waiting his turn like every other morning. Steam rose off broth he wasn't supposed to get twice in 1 week. It curled up past his chin into the frozen air, thin and quick, gone before it climbed a foot. The guards handed it over without ceremony, like it was nothing, like it happened every winter. No announcement, no lecture about gratitude. Just a ladle dipping and rising and dipping again down the line. Kyle told the fellow slave next to him about it later. That fellow slave apparently repeats everything to anyone who'll listen. According to him, this was the first time in 3 years anybody handed Kyle food he didn't have to bleed for first. He sat there working the broth around in his mouth, tongue against the salt of it, testing whether the memory of it would hold up the second time through. Something in his head recalculated while the warmth spread down into his chest. Bandit life, before the chains, cold nights under whatever roof hadn't already collapsed. Wind finding every gap in the walls. Fires that never lasted till dawn. Food you stole and then had to defend from your own crew. A fair chance some barren soldiers would put an arrow in your back before winter's end anyway. Slave life after the chains, a roof that doesn't leak. Food that shows up whether you begged for it or not. Work that hurts but doesn't kill you on any predictable schedule. Kyle did the arithmetic a starving man does better than any merchant. He worked it slow, turning each side of the ledger over the way he must have once turned over stolen coin. He came out the other side deciding that running was for fools. He'd stay. He'd swing the pickaxe. He'd eat the broth. I didn't need to chain that decision into him. The cold and a second bowl of soup did it for me, no words required. That's the kind of return on investment that doesn't show up until you're patient enough to wait for it. 6 in the morning, and my numbers came in the way they always do now. Quiet, certain, better than anything a priest ever promised anyone. Population 6,381. Of that number, 34 permanent slaves, Kyle among them. All of them now fully repaid or well on their way. Day's income, 6,381 silver. 1 coin for every soul breathing inside my walls. That is the whole beautiful mechanism I built this barony around. I sat with that number a while, turning it over in my head like a coin between 2 fingers. Slaves, I've decided, are the best financial instrument I've found so far in this backward, sword-swinging economy. No wages. No negotiation. Food and shelter as the only overhead, and even that comes back to me twice over in labor. A free man might get lured off by a better offer somewhere down the road. A slave doesn't have that option. Once he's decided staying beats leaving, he stops being a liability. He starts being close to pure profit. I actually caught myself hoping, honestly hoping, that some other bandit crew would get ambitious and try their luck against Greywood. Every failed raid is just a fresh shipment of quarry labor delivered to my doorstep free of charge. There's something wrong with a man who roots for banditry the way other men root for good weather. I'm aware of that. I've made my peace with it. The morning got more interesting when the watch reported a caravan on the eastern road. Heavy wagons, guild colors, moving slow under a weight of cargo. Golden Eagle Merchant Guild, their steward told my gatekeeper. A man named Mars. Mustache waxed, boots too clean for a road trip, the kind of face that's already spent your money before he said hello. Word travels fast in trade circles, apparently. Word coming out of my territory this past season had been that the new Baron was some upstart with more ambition than sense. Freshly installed, thin on supplies, and desperate enough for winter goods that he'd pay whatever he was told to pay. Mars had priced his wagons accordingly. Wheat, sheepskin coats, salt, the necessities of a hard winter. All marked up somewhere around 5 times what any honest trader would ask. He was banking on the idea that a cornered baron doesn't get to negotiate. He rolled his wagons through my gate expecting rubble and hungry peasants. What he got instead was a town with fresh timber walls. Granaries actually full, streets that weren't ankle deep in mud and desperation. 500 iron guards stood post in matched gear. The kind of men whose stillness tells you they've killed before and wouldn't mind doing it again. I watched his face do the math same as Kyle's had. His eyes moved from the walls to the guards to the granaries and back again. I could almost hear the numbers rearranging themselves behind his forehead. Except Mars' math came out considerably less comfortable for him. A baron who looks poor and desperate is easy to gouge. A baron who looks like this is the kind of man you want continuing to like you next season. He tried to open with his prices anyway, professional habit I suppose. He listed off numbers that would have made a duke wince. I didn't haggle. I don't find haggling productive when I've already decided what something's worth to me and the seller hasn't caught up yet. Instead I had my steward's wheel out chests. 40,000 silver in coin, 400 gold weight sitting there in the frost. The morning light caught the metal and threw it back in little points of brightness against the snow. I watched Mars track each chest as it came out, counting without meaning to count. I told Mars I'd take the entire shipment, all of it, at a price generous enough that nobody in his guild would ever call it an insult. Not his inflated number. Not some coin-pinching lowball either. Fair plus a cushion paid in full on the spot. Cash he could see and touch and count twice if he wanted to. Men like Mars don't know what to do with a buyer who pays more than necessary and asks for nothing shady in return. It breaks their instincts. He opened his mouth twice before anything useful came out of it. Then, before he'd finished stammering his thanks, I laid the second part on him. I wanted an exclusive contract going forward. Ongoing supply and not just wheat and coats. Slaves when his guild came across any worth selling. Refugees, if his caravans ever passed through territories emptying out from war or famine. Refugees are just population that hasn't been billed yet. Pig iron for the forges. Livestock for the pens. I wasn't asking him to be my supplier. I was asking him to be the artery that keeps this whole growing body fed, while I get around to conquering the space to put everyone in. Mars looked at the coin, looked at the guards, looked at the granaries behind me. 3 long looks, each one taking a little more starch out of his opening posture. He folded like a man who's just understood he's standing next to something bigger than his usual customers. He pledged the guild's service on the spot. He promised priority shipments. He promised his own signature on the paperwork before his superiors even saw it. Odd men make generous terms. I've learned to appreciate that particular weakness. By evening I sat with the numbers and let myself feel something close to satisfaction. For me that mostly registers as the absence of worry. 6,381 money trees, all of them now provisioned for the cold months ahead. Wheat secured, coats secured, salt secured. A supply line promised straight through to spring. Every tree that survives the winter is a tree that keeps dropping coins into my hand come spring. I intend for every single one of them to survive. That night the sky delivered the first real blizzard of the season. Wind came in low and hard against the shutters, carrying snow sideways instead of down. The kind that in most baronies kills serfs in their sleep. Quietly in huts with roofs too thin and walls too full of gaps. The kind of death nobody counts until the spring though uncovers the bodies. I know that statistic too. I looked it up before I ever set foot in this cold country. A lord who doesn't understand his own winter mortality rate is a lord flying blind on his own balance sheet. Somewhere in the serf quarter, a woman named Martha jerked awake from a dream where the cold had gotten into her chest and wouldn't leave. Her heart was still going fast from it when her eyes opened onto the dark. The kind of dream that feels less like a story and more like a rehearsal. She sat up expecting drafts. Expecting her son curled against her for warmth that wasn't enough. She braced for the particular silence of a hut losing its fight against the wind. Her hand went out first, toward where Pete should have been, bracing for cold skin. Instead she found warmth. Real warmth, walls that didn't rattle, a roof that held. Sheepskin piled over her and over Pete, her boy. He was sound asleep with a stomach full of the meat stew that had been handed out that evening along with the firewood ration. Pete stirred and told her, half asleep, mostly proud of himself for remembering it right, what the announcement crier had said when the storm clouds first rolled in. Everyone stays indoors. Nobody dies. Dying is a waste of the Baron's resources, the crier had said, more or less, blunt as a hammer. Then he added, almost as an afterthought, that since everyone would be stuck inside together for a few days, they might as well make some more children while they were at it. Pete laughed telling it, the way boys laugh at anything with a hint of scandal in it. Martha found herself laughing too, wet-eyed, half from the joke and half from something else entirely. She pulled the sheepskin higher over both of them. She lay listening to the wind fail against the timber. Word had already spread through the huts before the second wave of snow hit. Martha wasn't the only one crying that night. Quiet tears into sheepskin blankets that hadn't existed for her family a season ago. They said things about me that night I never asked anyone to say. More generous than what the traveling priests offered on their best sermons. They compared what I'd done for them to something closer to divine care than to a landlord managing his stock. I didn't order that gratitude. I ordered firewood and coats because dead serfs are unpaid taxes and empty fields. It turns out doing the math correctly looks, from the outside, exactly like kindness. Morning after the blizzard, the whole territory sat buried under snow deep enough to swallow a grown man to the waist. White over every road, every roof, every fence post. The kind of quiet that usually means the land is finished producing anything until spring. My own breath hung in front of me in a cloud as I walked the ridge above the fields. Boots punching through crust into softer drifts underneath. Except inside Ella's greenhouses, dug low into the earth with flues running heat underground the way I'd described to her weeks earlier. Something green was pushing up out of dark soil that shouldn't have supported anything at all in this weather. Wheat seedlings, actual seedlings, thin and pale but alive. Standing in rows inside structures built by serf labor I'd conscripted for exactly this purpose. Heated by a design that owed nothing to any local farmer's grandfather's wisdom. Ella stood over one of the beds with her hands not quite touching the shoots. Like she was worried they'd vanish if she poked them. Her breath fogged over the rows in short bursts. Every so often she leaned in close enough that it must have warmed the leaves themselves. She kept saying, more to herself than to me, that her composting theory alone never should have worked this well. She said it needed the underground heat to do what it was doing. The two things together had done something neither could have managed apart. I watched her circle the bed twice. Her fingers finally dropped just barely to graze one seedling's leaf. She pulled back like she'd touched something hot instead of something cold and green. Something in the way she looked at me afterward had shifted. From the wary, keep your distance calculation she started with, into something closer to plain admiration. The kind that doesn't bother hiding itself anymore. I wasn't especially interested in the miracle framing. Green shoots in the snow make for a nice story, but stories don't feed 6,000 people. I asked her for numbers instead. She gave them to me carefully, like she still wasn't sure I'd believe her. 2,000 acres under this method, plus the 20 greenhouses already up and running. By her estimate, the eventual harvest could feed the current population for 3 full years running. 3 years of food security from land that, by every local farming tradition, should have been dead until the spring thaw. My mind didn't stay on the wheat for long. It went straight to the number behind the number. More food doesn't mean fewer people starving. It means I can afford to bring in more people. More people means more silver landing in my hand every single morning at 6 o'clock without me lifting a finger past the initial investment. I started running rough figures right there in the frost, breath fogging over the calculations in my head. Population at 20,000 instead of 6,000, income scaling right alongside it. Tens of thousands of silver a day if I pushed the growth hard enough and fast enough. Ella brought up the firewood cost for keeping the flues running all winter. She was worried it might be eating too far into the treasury. I told her money means nothing if it's what makes the crops grow. That much is true enough that I didn't need to think twice about saying it. Then I turned and walked off toward the manor before she could finish her next sentence. Snow crunched under my boots the whole way back. Each step another number falling into place behind my eyes. Today, of everything on my calendar this season, was shaping up to be an extremely important day. I didn't have time yet to explain why. The blizzard had been falling on and off for half a month when Mars finally rode back through the western gate. A caravan trailed behind him like a wounded snake, dragging its length through the snow. I counted wagons before I counted people, out of habit, the way I counted everything. The number pleased me at first. 1,200 heads bought at rock-bottom prices from barons too poor or too desperate to feed their own subjects through winter. My ledger brain was already running the math before the gates opened. 7,500 silver a day in projected income, once these new bodies settled into work. Then the first wagon door creaked open. A woman fell out onto the snow instead of climbing down, and I stopped counting silver. Her lips were the color of a bruise. Her fingers were black at the tips. The smell that rolled off the wagon bed was the smell of a sick room, not a marketplace. I walked the length of that caravan in half an hour. Every 10th face told the same story. Fever sweat frozen to skin, coughing that rattled like loose gravel, frostbite eating fingers and toes down to the second knuckle. Somewhere in the back of a cart, a man lay still enough that I did not check whether he was breathing. Mars had gone out to buy quality assets and come home with a plague wagon dressed up as a labor force. I grabbed him by the collar in front of his own men. I asked him, in a voice too quiet to be mistaken for calm, whether he understood what dysentery does to a settlement of 6,000 packed shoulder to shoulder in winter tents. He stammered something about the price being too good to pass up. He said something about baronies practically giving these people away. I told him a good price on rot is still rot. One outbreak of fever through my healthy population, and I would lose more than 1,200 bodies. I would lose the whole town's ability to work, eat, and pay me back for the roofs over their heads. The system still logged all 1,206 of them as legitimate citizens the instant they crossed the boundary line. It added their weight to my daily income projection without asking whether they would live to earn it. I looked at that number glowing in my vision and felt nothing like triumph. Only the cold arithmetic of a man staring at inventory that might spoil before it ships. I told Mars that if he ever bought a shipment without inspecting it first again, I would have him mucking the pig pens for a year. I meant every word of it. Then I turned my back on him and started giving orders. Standing around being angry does not build a fence. I sent runners to Gareth before I had finished walking back to the square. I told him to seal off the western edge of town, the windward side where the cold cuts hardest and the healthy population lives farthest away. No refugee from that caravan would set foot inside the residential blocks, not one. Not even the children who looked healthy, because looking healthy and being healthy are two different ledgers. Gareth's men had wooden fencing up before nightfall, crude and ugly. A wall is a wall when it stands between fever and 6,000 levs. I ordered tents raised inside the fence line, as many as we could spare. Cauldrons of water were kept boiling around the clock, because heat and steam were the only medicine I trusted anyone in Greywood to produce on short notice. Nobody crossed that fence without my direct order, in either direction. I posted guards with orders to enforce that rule against anyone, sick or healthy, noble or slave. I halted all further purchasing of refugees on the spot, no exceptions. Not until I could trust my own buyers to check a person's pulse before they checked the asking price. Word spread through town fast that the Lord had built a cage on the edge of the settlement. I let people call it a cage if they wanted, so long as they stayed on the correct side of the fence. I needed someone inside the quarantine zone who understood sickness better than a soldier or a steward. My mind went unfairly straight to Ella. When Gareth's men brought her to the fence line, she planted her boots in the snow. She told me flatly that she studied crops, not people, and that botany was not medicine no matter how badly I wanted it to be. I told her a fever is a fever whether it is burning through a stalk of wheat or a human chest. I told her half of medicine is just knowing which plant to boil. She argued that the two fields were not the same at all. A wrong dose of the wrong root could kill faster than the frostbite would. I told her that doing nothing would kill faster still. I reminded her that she held the title of Minister of Agriculture in this town. That title came with obligations beyond counting seedlings in a warm greenhouse. She glared at me with the particular fury of someone who knows the argument is unwinnable and hates that it is unwinnable. Then she went to work anyway. Within a day she had catalogued every herb we kept in storage against fever, frostbite, and the runs. She sorted them the same clinical way she sorted seed stock, by yield and by risk. She sent word that willow bark eased fever. Certain root pastes drew the black rot out of frostbitten skin if applied before the tissue died completely. Boiling everything first mattered more than any single ingredient, she said. I never thanked her properly for it, because in my head this was simply resource allocation. It was moving a skilled worker from one department to another where she was needed more. She would have hated the thanks anyway, I told myself. That was as close as I let myself come to feeling guilty about dragging her into a field hospital. The quarantine zone needed hands more than it needed theory. Theory alone does not spoon soup into a dying woman's mouth. I thought of Martha immediately, the mother whose family had survived an earlier blizzard, because I had opened my storehouses to the town. I sent for her. She arrived at the fence line wrapped in a scarf 3 times too thick for her. She took one look at the rows of tents and started giving orders to the women standing around her before I had finished explaining what I needed. Within 2 days she had organized over 300 people into what I started calling, in the privacy of my own head, a battlefield medical team. Nobody in Greywood had ever seen a real battlefield hospital to compare it to. Most of her recruits were women whose husbands worked the quarry or the fields. The rest were elderly townspeople whose backs could no longer carry firewood but whose hands could still wring out a wet cloth. I paid each of them 3 copper a day. I added half a pound of flour bonus for every patient who walked out of that quarantine zone alive instead of being carried out. I framed the payment to them as protecting the town's property. A living refugee eventually produces silver, and a dead one produces nothing but a body to bury in frozen ground. Martha's team used strong liquor to scrub wounds clean, cheap grain spirit that stung enough to make grown men curse. We had no proper physician's tools, and alcohol was the only disinfectant Greywood could produce in bulk. They boiled Ella's herbs into a soup thick enough to stand a spoon in. They forced it down the throats of patients too weak to feed themselves, 1 spoonful at a time for hours if that is what it took. Their hands were rough, cracked from cold and lye soap. Their bedside manner would have horrified any trained healer. Nobody in that quarantine zone was left to shiver alone in a tent. I remember a girl named Anna, barely more than a child. She was brought in with frostbite eating up both her hands and a fever that had her muttering to nobody. Martha sat with her through 2 full nights, forcing soup into her past the point where Anna had stopped fighting to refuse it. When Anna finally came back to herself enough to speak, she asked Martha why the Lord would spend good coins saving trash like her instead of letting nature take its course. Her voice when she asked it was thin as paper. Martha told her that in this Lord's eyes, as long as a person could still draw breath, they were not trash. Even a crippled hand, Martha told her, could learn to twist hemp rope into something worth selling. I was not there to hear that exchange. Gareth repeated it to me later, and I said nothing in response beyond a nod. Agreeing out loud would have meant admitting what it actually meant. I watched the quarantine zone from outside the fence most evenings, arms crossed, breath fogging in the cold. I told myself I was reviewing an operation, not visiting the sick. In my head, every patient in those tents was a cog gone rusty. A piece of machinery worth oiling back into motion, because idle cogs produce nothing and dead cogs are simply gone. I did not let myself think about the individual faces, the coughing children, the old men whose hands shook too hard to hold their own spoons. A man running a settlement of 7,000 cannot afford to grieve over every broken part before it is fixed. And yet I kept authorizing more liquor, more flour, more firewood for those tents. I kept spending real silver on people who had produced nothing for me yet and might never produce anything at all. If anyone had asked me why, I would have answered with numbers. Mortality rates, projected labor recovered, the cost of losing a healthy population to disease. The truth sat somewhere underneath the numbers, in a place I did not examine too closely. Examining it would have cost me the comfort of pretending I was only running a machine. By the 2nd week, the fever deaths in the quarantine zone had started to slow. I told myself that was proof the system was working, nothing more sentimental than that. Just as the sick tents began to stabilize, Baal came to me with a face that told me the reprieve would not last. He reported that the forest ringing Greywood had been cut down to stumps and brush. It had been stripped bare by a population that had outgrown its own woodpile months ago. 7,000 people now called this town home, and every one of them wanted a fire burning through a winter that showed no sign of breaking. The quarantine tents alone burned through wood day and night to keep the boiling water going. Ella's greenhouse flues ran constantly to hold back frost from the wheat she had planted out of season. Ball's estimate landed on my desk like a stone. At the current rate of consumption, we had perhaps 3 days of firewood left before the fires across town started going cold one by one. 3 days before people froze in their beds. 3 days before the greenhouse wheat that represented months of Ella's work died in a single hard night. Sending men into the forest to cut deeper timber during an active blizzard meant risking dozens of them freezing to death. They would be chasing wood that might not even reach town before the crisis hit. I sat with the numbers a long while, turning over the only other option I could see. Buying charcoal shipped in from distant cities at prices that only made sense to merchants who knew exactly how desperate I was. Winter fuel prices from outside barons would have gutted my treasury in a week. I was doing the math on how many silver pieces I could bleed before the town's finances went the way of the firewood. That was when Gareth came through my door without knocking, snow still melting off his shoulders. He was talking faster than I had heard him talk in months. He said the slaves working the quarry, Kyle among them, had broken through into a seam of black rock, unlike anything they had cut before. It stained their hands and tools black on contact. It crumbled if you pressed it too hard. Every one of the quarry slaves had gone pale, convinced they had dug into something cursed. Work at the quarry had stopped entirely. The slaves refused to touch the seam again without direct orders, muttering about demons buried under Greywood's own hills. I had heard enough stories of superstition among tired, frightened laborers to know better than to dismiss it outright. But the description nagged at something in the back of my mind. I pulled on my coat and told Gareth to take me to the quarry myself. A firewood crisis with 3 days left on the clock does not leave room for waiting on reports. The wind cut sideways across the open quarry pit when we arrived. The slaves stood clustered at the far edge of the new cut, as far from the black seam as the rock walls allowed. Kyle stood among them, recognizable even bundled in rags against the cold. He watched me with the wary stillness of a man expecting to be blamed for something he had not caused. I walked to the seam alone and crouched beside it. I ran my gloved fingers over stone the color of char, darker than any coal I had ever seen described in a book. I had never seen the real thing before either. It crumbled exactly the way Gareth had described, flaking black dust onto the snow. It stained my glove in a smear that would not brush off easily. I picked up a fist-sized chunk and turned it over, weighing it in my palm. Something about the density and the grain of it lit a small, quiet spark of an idea. I did not want to say it out loud yet in case I was wrong. I called for a torch. One of the guards brought me a burning brand from the fire they kept going at the quarry entrance to ward off the cold. I held the torch to the black rock and waited. The flame licked at the surface without much happening at first. The crowd behind me shifted nervously. Then the edge of the rock caught, slow and stubborn. A dull orange crept into the black before it settled into a steady, glowing burn. It put off more heat against my face than the torch itself had. I stood there holding a piece of burning stone in the middle of a snowbound quarry. The cold arithmetic in my head went quiet for exactly as long as it took me to understand what I was looking at. This was coal, the same fuel that had powered furnaces and forges and entire cities in the world I remembered before Greywood. It had been sitting in a seam under our own quarry the whole time, waiting for someone to be desperate enough to dig into it. I laughed once short and disbelieving. Every slave near me flinched like I had cracked a whip instead. They thought I was reacting to a curse, and given how they were looking at the burning rock in my hand, I understood why. I turned to face them still holding the burning piece. I told them plainly that there was no demon in this hillside, only fuel. The kind of fuel that would keep this entire town warm for the rest of the winter and beyond. Kyle asked, in a voice that clearly expected punishment for the question, whether they had done something wrong by digging into it. I told him the opposite was true. He and every slave standing in that pit had just stumbled onto something worth more to Greywood than the stone they had been assigned to cut. Relief moved through the group in a visible wave, shoulders dropping. A few of them exchanged looks that were almost disbelieving. I gave the order on the spot to convert the quarry into a proper coal mine. I redirected every available hand toward following that seam deeper into the hillside. I did not free Kyle or any of the others. Freedom had never been part of the arrangement, and I saw no reason to pretend otherwise now. What I gave them instead was double rations, warm coats pulled from town storage, and a new title. Coal miners, spoken with enough weight that a few of them actually stood straighter hearing it. Keeping my workforce alive, fed, and productive had always been the actual bargain. Whether or not anyone chose to call that bargain kindness. Kyle, at least, looked at his new coat like it meant something more than fabric. I let him have that without comment. By evening, the first cart of black rock rolled down from the quarry into town. Guards walked alongside it with the same wary distance the slaves had shown at the seam. One of the gate guards, a man named Pete, wrinkled his nose at the smell coming off the cart. He muttered that it stank like something a demon had passed in its sleep. Nobody argued with him, because the sulfur smell rolling off raw coal was unlike anything Greywood's chimneys had ever produced before. Gareth, never a patient man, grabbed a chunk of it and dropped it straight into a dying hearth fire in one of the guard posts. He did it more to settle the argument than out of any careful plan. The fire caught slow the way it had at the quarry. Then it built into a steady burn that put the old firewood flames to shame. Heat rolled off that hearth in a way I had not felt from any fireplace in this town. 3 times the strength of the best seasoned wood we had ever burned. It kept burning long after a wood fire that size would have collapsed into embers. Word moved through Greywood faster than any of my official announcements ever managed. By the next morning, half the town had heard that the Lord had pulled black gold out of the quarry. Chimneys across Greywood started putting out smoke with that same sulfur edge to it. One household at a time, as coal carts made their rounds delivering the new fuel to hearths that had been rationing wood for weeks. Nobody complained about the smell for long. A house that stays warm through the night is worth tolerating a strange odor for. To people who had been counting their remaining firewood in handfuls, that sulfur smoke was the sweetest thing they had breathed in all winter. I redirected coal shipments first to the quarantine zone, where the boiling cauldrons needed a fuel supply the forest could no longer provide. The change in how quickly water came to a boil there was immediate. Martha's team stopped rationing hot water for the first time since the crisis began. I noticed, without letting myself dwell on it, that the mortality numbers coming out of that zone kept dropping alongside the extra heat. Ella benefited from the coal even more than the quarantine zone did. Her greenhouse flues had been running on borrowed time against a firewood supply that was never going to hold through the season. With coal feeding those flues instead, she could push the internal temperature of her growing beds higher than the old wood fires had ever allowed. Closer to something resembling actual summer heat. I found her the day after the first coal shipment arrived at the greenhouse. She was sketching out planting schedules on scraps of paper with an energy I had not seen from her since the wheat first sprouted out of season. She told me, without waiting for me to ask, that if the flues could hold this new temperature steady, she wanted to try fast-growing warm-season vegetables in the dead of winter. These were crops that should have had no business surviving this far north in this season at all. I told her to draw up whatever she needed and I would find the coal to fuel it. For once she did not argue with me about the scope of the request. She muttered something about not knowing what else this fuel would let her attempt, half to herself, already sketching a new bed layout before I had left the greenhouse. I stood in the doorway a moment longer than I needed to, watching steam rise off soil that had no right to be that warm in the middle of a Greywood winter. The coal mine kept producing faster than I expected once the fear wore off the workforce. Cart after cart rolled down from the quarry every day to feed hearths, flues, and forges across the settlement. Baal's earlier warning about 3 days of firewood left quietly stopped mattering. It was buried under a fuel source that did not care how bare the surrounding forest had been cut. I sat with the morning ledger a few days later, the way I did every morning, running my eyes down the numbers the way another man might check the weather. Population had climbed again. Refugees who had survived the quarantine now counted as healthy citizens, adding their weight back onto the income projections I had frozen weeks earlier. Daily silver income had climbed with them, past the 7,500 mark I had once celebrated. That was before the sickness in that caravan soared the number for me. The quarantine zone's death count, tracked separately from everything else, had bent downward for 4 days running. It was the first sustained drop since Mars had ridden through the gate with his cargo of fever and frostbite. The firewood crisis that had threatened to freeze half the town inside 3 days sat resolved on paper. It had been replaced by a fuel source dug out of ground I had walked over 100 times without knowing what sat beneath it. I closed the ledger and poured myself a cup of tea gone lukewarm while I read. I walked to the window of my study. Snow was still falling outside, steady and unhurried, settling over rooftops that were, for the first time in weeks, all putting out smoke instead of standing cold and dark. I let myself sit with that sight longer than the numbers alone deserved. Tea cooling further in my hand, the tension I had been carrying since Mars rode through the gate loosened by degrees. Nothing in that ledger, nothing in that quiet snowfall outside my window, told me the winter had finished testing what Greywood could survive. The gate torches guttered against the snow when the horns went up. I woke before my eyes even opened, because the system was already doing arithmetic in my skull. 1 in the morning, it told me, cold and exact as a ledger line. Population steady at 7,587. Threat detected at the northern approach. I lay there for 2 heartbeats letting the words land. Then I was moving. I threw a coat over my nightshirt without bothering to lace it. I ran for the wall, boots skidding on packed ice. What I found on the other side of that wall looked less like an army and more like a famine that had grown legs and learned to march. 200 orcs, maybe more, poured out of the tree line. They came as a wall of green-gray muscle and frost-cracked skin. Chief Grom the Bonebreaker stood out in front of them. He roared something that needed no translation into any human tongue. They weren't marching in any disciplined sense. They were starving, and starving bodies do not keep formation. The blizzard had eaten their winter stores the same way it had come close to eating ours. Somewhere out in that howling dark, they had caught the smell of smoke drifting off Greywood's chimneys. They had caught the smell of livestock too, and of roasting grain. That scent carried on wine that should have killed it long before it reached them. Their bodies had made a decision their minds no longer had strength left to argue with. I watched Gareth's iron guard form up on the wall. There was not one wasted motion in the whole line. 500 men stood there who had spent the winter eating full rations instead of half ones. 500 men who had drilled all season in real steel instead of scavenged scrap. I thought, standing there in the cold with my coat still unlaced, that this was not shaping up to be a battle at all. A starving mob throwing itself at a fed and armored garrison is not a battle. It is a transaction, and I could already tell the exchange rate would be obscene. My breath came out in short white clouds while I watched the green wave close the distance. I gave one order before the gates opened. I made certain it carried down the whole line man to man, until it reached the far end of the wall. Take them alive where you can, I said. Cut the tendon behind the ankle instead of putting a spear through the chest. I heard the order ripple through the ranks like a stone dropped in still water. Soldiers who had braced themselves for a fight to the death were being told to maim instead of kill. The confusion in their faces was plain even in torchlight. Orders are orders, though, and mine came with reasons. I chose not to say most of those reasons out loud in front of 500 men. An orc's hide turns aside a glancing blade better than boiled leather ever could. An orc's back can haul stone that would buckle a mule's spine in a single afternoon. And an orc, unlike a mule, can be registered, taxed, and put to work under my seal. The fight itself barely deserved the name once it started. Iron Guard held the gate in a shield line 3 deep, steady as a wall of its own. Steel-tipped spears punched through orc leather the way a hot knife goes through wet paper. There was almost no resistance at all. Crossbow bolts rained down from the wall in volleys. The men above never waited for the last bolt to land before losing the next. I could hear the strings snap and hum in a rhythm that never once broke. The orcs broke themselves against that line in waves, one after another. Each wave came in weaker than the one before it and slower. Legs failed under bodies that had nothing left to burn. Grom himself went down eventually. 4 spearmen pinned his arms while a 5th found the tendon behind his ankle and opened it. They hamstrung him rather than finishing him where he stood, exactly as I had ordered. Less than an hour after the first horn sounded, the horn sounded again. This time the call was to break off the chase, not to start one. I stood on the parapet afterward, doing sums while my breath fogged out in front of me and froze on the stone. None of the sums I was running involved the word victory, not once. Morning came gray, and it came merciless, the way winter mornings do when they have nothing to apologize for. It laid the whole ledger out across the snow for anyone with eyes to read. 120 orc bodies lay scattered across the killing field outside the gate. They were already stiffening in the cold by the time the light came up. Crows had begun working up the courage to land near them. Inside the walls, in the square, 82 more knelt in a long chained row. Their wrists were lashed to a single common line. They waited to see what an exiled noble's version of mercy might look like up close. Grom knelt at the head of that line. A rag was bound tight around the stump where his ankle tendon used to work. It had soaked through and started to freeze at the edges. His eyes stayed fixed on some point past my shoulder. It was the look of a man who has already decided how the scene ends, and is only waiting to learn the details. Bale walked beside me down the row. I watched his face try to arrange itself into something steady, and fail more than once. I stopped in front of the chief and took his forearm in both hands. I inspected it the way I might a draft horse before paying good coin for it. I turned the arm over slowly, feeling the slabs of muscle move under skin still numb from frost. I pressed a thumb along his spine where it showed through a tear in his hide vest, testing the give of it. The orc did not flinch, though his jaw worked once hard and went still again. Baal asked, in that careful tone he uses when he suspects I am about to say something he will have to explain to the rest of the town later, what exactly I thought I was looking at. I told him these were not monsters kneeling in our square. I told him they were zero-cost, high-return heavy machinery. No forge in the world could build them, and no coin in our treasury could buy them outright. Putting a blade through assets like these instead of a harness would be a waste bordering on a sin, and I said so plainly. Baal did not answer me. I have learned over the winter to read that particular silence of his as horror wearing its Sunday clothes. It dresses up and stands quiet at the back of the room. I had a clerk bring out the registration ledger. He carried a stamp pad thick with red ink that had clearly been prepared in advance. I crouched down in front of Grom myself, close enough to smell the blood dried stiff into the fur along his jaw. Frost had crusted along his eyelashes, and it did not melt even that close to my breath. I told him, in the flattest voice I own, that his tribe had exactly 2 ways to leave this square. One of those ways involved a burial pit dug before nightfall. The other involved his thumb pressed to a piece of paper. That paper would make him and every surviving orc behind him the legal property of Greywood Town. Registered laborers, I told him, under my seal, fed and housed and worked until I decided otherwise. I set the point of my sword against the hollow of his throat while I waited for his answer. The metal did not waver. Did not take him long to give me one. His thumb went down on the ink pad first. Then it went down on the parchment beneath it, pressing hard enough to leave the mark whole. 81 more thumbs followed his down the line after that. Not one of them needed the sword repeated to make the point land. The notification arrived in the corner of my vision with its usual bloodless cheer. It was indifferent to everything that had just happened in front of it. 82 new citizens registered, it read. Population 7,669. Regional heavy labor efficiency projected to climb sharply, it added, as if that were the headline of the morning. Something in my chest unclenched that I had not known was clenched in the first place. It was the particular relief of watching a balance sheet tip back into black after a night that could have gone very differently for everyone standing in that square. By noon I had all 82 marched out to the coal mine and the stone quarry. They went in a single chained column, guards flanking them on both sides. I set their daily quota high. It was high enough that the old bandit slaves I had broken to obedience earlier in the winter earned themselves a promotion out of the pits. They moved into overseer posts instead. Whips traded out for tally sticks, and a warmer coat to stand watch in. It struck me, watching the column trudge off between 2 lines of guards, that I had built an entire hierarchy of exploitation in less time than it takes bread to rise. Every rung of that hierarchy was staffed by people who, a season earlier, had been trying their level best to kill each other. The steel came together not long after that morning, and I take a cleaner satisfaction in that particular success. Nobody bled for it who had not volunteered to stand near a kiln of their own free will. Copperhammer had been burning raw coal in his forge all winter long, out of necessity rather than preference. The iron that came out the other end of that process had a temper like a spoiled child. It snapped at the first hard use it was put to. I sat him down in his own smithy one afternoon. I sketched out something his grandfather's grandfather never had the chance to learn. Seal the coal in an earthen kiln, I told him. Starve it of open flame. Bake the sulfur and the other filth out of it slow, over days rather than hours. What is left when you crack the kiln open afterward is not coal anymore at all. It is coke, clean burning and hot enough, pure enough to pull real carbon into iron instead of poisoning the metal as it forms. He built the kiln exactly as I had described it, brick by brick. He packed it full and sealed the vents with wet clay pressed smooth by hand. Then he made me wait 3 full days while it cooked. I remember pacing past that kiln twice a day, watching thin smoke thread out of the seams and telling myself it meant nothing yet. When he finally broke the seal open and pulled out blocks of gray, honeycombed coke, his hands were shaking as he lifted the first one to the light. He held it up with both palms, the way a man might cradle a relic pulled out of scripture. He fed it into the forge that same afternoon. He folded new steel over itself a dozen times under the hammer before he was satisfied. Sparks came off the anvil in long orange arcs, and the ring of the hammer changed pitch with every fold, climbing higher and cleaner each time. By evening he was standing over a finished blade. When he flicked a nail against the flat of it, the steel rang like a bell. I watched tears cut clean tracks through the soot layered across his face. He said, more to the sword in his hands than to me standing beside him, that he had waited 30 years to see metal behave like this. He said he had stopped believing he would ever live to see it. I took that blade out to the yard myself afterward. I set up one of our old spears in a stump. It was the brittle gray stuff we had been arming half the guard with since long before I arrived in this town. One swing was all it took, no wind-up worth mentioning behind it. The new steel went through the shaft without a shiver of resistance. There was not so much as a notch left in the edge afterward. I turned the blade over twice in the winter light to be sure. I told Gareth to start pulling every old weapon out of the armory by the end of the week. Real steel from here forward, I said, or nothing goes on a soldier's belt at all. Mars showed up 3 days after that conversation. He rode in with the sort of expression that told me the math was already running behind his eyes before he had even dismounted. The golden eagle chamber of commerce seemed to radiate off him in waves, even through a winter coat. He had heard whispers about coal, and about a town that had burned through a winter cold enough to freeze 3 baronies solid. He wanted to talk about selling raw coal at whatever price the northern nobility would bear before the frost finally broke. I let him finish laying out his pitch in full before I said a word. Then I told him, flat, that it was the worst idea I had heard all season, and I meant it. A coal seam this rich, sitting in the hands of a disgraced exile with no army worth the name behind him, is not a trade secret. It is an invitation, plain and open, and any noble with a working set of eyes would read it that way. The first noble who worked out where that heat was actually coming from would have a banditry charge, or a consorting with demons charge, drawn up by lunchtime. An army would be marching on grey wood by the week after that. Nothing draws a hungry lord's eye faster than a poor man suddenly failing to look poor anymore. So instead I showed Mars something else entirely. I had already had a batch of coal dust ground fine and worked through with clay and a handful of bitter herbs. That mixture had been pressed into small hexagonal bricks. They looked, if you did not already know better, like nothing found anywhere in nature. I told Mars to call them alchemy warm stones, relics his own guild had supposedly dug out of some collapsed ruin far to the north. Mysterious, half-understood, radiating a heat no ordinary hearth fuel could hope to match, was the story I gave him to sell. Nothing about them, sold that way, points a finger back toward Greywood's ground underneath it all. I offered him a split, 70 for me and 30 for him. I made him swear the stones would never touch a commoner's hand. Only noble houses with coin to burn and no reason to ask where a legend came from, I told him, and he agreed to the condition. He took the terms inside of a minute, barely pausing to think it over. Merchants recognize a good margin faster than they recognize danger standing right next to it. That is precisely why I trust him to sell the story and not to ask too many questions about the truth sitting underneath it. The trouble that story was always going to attract found us less than 2 weeks later. It rode up to the northern border with an escort of 20 armed men and a banner I recognized before I recognized the man riding beneath it. Victor, chief political officer to Lord Redleaf, had come to look an exiled pauper's fief up and down. He had come, in other words, to decide for his master whether the rumors of sudden wealth meant opportunity, threat, or some mixture of both. I was not at the gate when his column first arrived. I heard about it fast enough anyway, because Gareth sent a runner at a dead sprint the moment the banner came into view. Victor's guard captain had ridden up to the gate expecting, sort of welcome you give a lord's representative in a backwater nobody bothers defending properly. Instead he found a wall manned by soldiers standing in real steel, not scrap. He found orc laborers hauling cartloads of ore under overseer watch, all of it in plain sight of the road. He found a gate captain who had no intention of opening anything to anyone without an explanation offered first. The captain demanded entry, and courtesy befitting his lord's name along with it. Gareth demanded the escort surrender its weapons before a single boot crossed the threshold, and he did not soften the demand. Neither man showed any sign of backing down first. By the time I reached the gate on foot, the standoff had taken on the particular brittle quality of a situation one wrong word away from becoming a body count. I could hear horses shifting their weight behind Victor's line, iron shoes scraping on the frozen road. I stepped between the two lines with my hands loose at my sides. I pitched my voice somewhere between apology and command. That is the register I have found works best on men more afraid of looking foolish than of actually fighting. I told Victor's captain that Greywood extended every courtesy to guests, and every caution to armed strangers standing at its gate. The two were not in conflict, I said, not if he would simply allow my men to hold his weapons in trust for the length of his visit. I watched Victor himself take my measure while I spoke. His eyes moved from the steel on my guard's hips to the orcs working the road beyond the wall. They moved on from there to the general absence of the threadbare desperation he had clearly ridden north expecting to find waiting for him. Whatever report had reached Lord Redleaf's desk about this place, it had not prepared his officer for what stood in front of him now. The standoff broke on my invitation rather than on anyone's blade, which is the outcome I always prefer above every other. Dead envoys tend to generate far more expensive problems than live ones ever do. I asked Victor in for tea. I framed it as an opportunity to discuss a proposal his lord would find, I promised, very profitable. I watched the calculation shift behind his eyes, moving from suspicion towards something closer to appetite. Appetite I can work with. Appetite has a price, and prices are the one language I have never had trouble speaking. We walked in together through gates manned by soldiers armed better than half of Redleaf's own garrison. We passed orc laborers who, a season ago, would have been raiding this exact stretch of road instead of clearing it. I felt the system tick over in the back of my skull the way it does every morning at 6, indifferent to Victor's presence beside me. It was indifferent to the tension still sitting stiff in his shoulders, and indifferent to anything in the world but the count. Population 8,105. Victor took his seat across the table from me, folded his hands, and waited for me to start explaining a fortune he was clearly still struggling to believe was real. I poured the tea myself, unhurried, taking my time with the pot before I said a single word about business. Steam curled off the surface between us while neither of us spoke, and I let it sit there a moment longer than I needed to. Whatever proposal I was about to lay in front of him, the real negotiation had already started. It started the moment he rode up to a gate expecting to find beggars, and found steel waiting for him instead. The tea had gone cold long before Victor said what he came to say. I let it sit there between us anyway, untouched, a small prop on the table. Steam had stopped rising from it some time ago, and neither of us mentioned that. A man who drinks calmly while his guest fidgets has already won half the negotiation. I had learned that rule somewhere in my old life and never once seen it fail. It cost nothing to apply and paid dividends every time. Victor opened soft, the way men with armies standing behind them always do. He kept his hands folded, his voice level, his eyes doing most of the actual talking. Lord Redleaf, he said, was concerned. He let the word hang there a beat, testing how it landed. Concerned that an unregistered operation on his border was producing profits nobody could account for. Concerned, he added, in the particular tone people use when they mean the opposite of concerned. What he meant, plainly, was hand it over. I let him finish the whole rehearsed paragraph without interrupting once. I wanted him to hear himself say every polite, empty word of it. Words like that sound different once a man has said them out loud to a silent room. Only then did I set the dagger on the table between us. Steel, freshly forged, still carrying a faint trace of the furnace in its smell. The metal caught the light from the window and threw a thin line of it across the cloth. I didn't point it at him. I didn't need to. I only let it lie there among the teacups while I recited the numbers. 8,000 citizens, registered and counted, living inside my walls. 500 guards, armored head to toe in steel that would blunt every blade Red Leaf could field on short notice. Near 100 orc laborers besides, who did not tire, did not desert, and did not care whose banner flew over the mines so long as the food kept arriving. I watched each number land on him the way stones land in still water. Then I told him the part he actually needed to hear. If Red Leaf tried to take the mountain by force, I would collapse the mine myself before I let it become someone else's income. Everyone freezes together, I told him. Myself included. I have no attachment to freezing last. Watching a political officer recalculate his entire approach in real-time ranks among the more satisfying things I have witnessed. Victor did it beautifully. His shoulders dropped half an inch. His eyes flicked toward the door, checking, almost against his own will, that it was still there. I gave him a few seconds to sit inside that discomfort before sliding the second thing across the table. Not a weapon this time. A ledger bound in plain leather, unremarkable to look at. 2,000 silver, packed and waiting in a chest downstairs, framed as a mineral tax owed to the crown he answered to. On top of that, an ongoing tribute. 20% of the coal briquette profits, delivered monthly to Red Leaf City, filed as legitimate revenue rather than the extortion it plainly resembled. In exchange, I wanted only one thing. A public declaration. Greywood's mineral holdings, placed under Red Leaf's official protection. A piece of paper. A seal pressed into wax. A rumor that would ripple outward to every ambitious lord within riding distance, and tell them this particular pasture already had an owner. Victor's relief was almost embarrassing to watch. His whole posture eased, like a man setting down a weight he had carried up several flights of stairs. He complimented my tea, cold as it was. He complimented the town, its order, its stacked timber and clean streets. On his way out the door he complimented my remarkable good sense for a man so recently exiled. As though good sense were a rare mineral I had stumbled onto by luck rather than built with my own hands. I walked him to the gate and watched his carriage roll down the frozen road. I stood there until the dust settled behind the wheels. Only then did I myself smile properly. 20% paid monthly in exchange for a shield I hadn't had to fight for. A fair price today. Not a fair price forever. Every silver coin I sent to Red Leaf City was a loan against a future where my 500 guards became 5,000. When that day came, I intended to collect the interest personally, with armed men standing behind me instead of a teapot. For now, tribute. Later, an invoice. Inside my own walls, a different kind of accounting had started to bother me. Population crossed 8,000 that week. Instead of feeling only pride at the number, I noticed something uglier creeping into the ledgers underneath it. People had gotten comfortable. Free rations had done exactly what free rations always do past a certain point. The first bowl earns gratitude. The 100th bowl earns expectation. By the 200th, nobody thanks you for it anymore. They just show up late for work, because the food arrives either way, whether they hurry or not. I had built a town that no longer had to try. A town that doesn't have to try stops producing at the rate I need it to. So I called Baal in and told him to end it. All of it. Every free ration, effective immediately, no exceptions carved out for anyone. His face did something complicated. Somewhere between horror and disbelief, as if I had asked him to set the granary on fire with his own hands. I let him sit inside that horror for exactly as long as it took to explain the other half of the plan. Cutting people off without giving them somewhere to land isn't strategy. It's cruelty, and cruelty doesn't scale. From now on, labor earned copper. Mining, land clearing, spinning wool, cutting timber. Every task got a wage attached to it, paid out at the end of each working day, coin counted into each pair of hands before they left the yard. And to spend that copper, I opened the doors on a new building at the center of town. The Lord's Marketplace, stocked with flour, salted meat, warm coats, and cheap liquor. All of it notably sold by me. Ball did the math out loud before I could stop him, and got it half right. He pointed out that the coin I paid them in the morning walked straight back into my own strongbox by evening. He asked, not unreasonably, what exactly I had accomplished besides moving silver in a circle. I told him the circle wasn't the point. The point was what happened to a person in the hours between earning the coin and spending it. A man who receives food for free has no reason to move faster than he has to. A man chasing his own wage moves like his life depends on it. In the small, immediate monthly budget sense, it does. I wasn't buying labor with copper. I was buying urgency, and copper was only the mechanism that delivered it. The change didn't take a season. It took a single night. By the following morning, the town had rearranged itself into something closer to a machine running at full pressure. Carts moved before dawn, wheels cracking the last skin of frost on the road. The mine crews argued over shift assignments instead of dragging their feet into them. Women at the spinning wheels raced each other for the extra piece rate bonus I had tacked onto anything finished before noon. Even the guards on the wall stood straighter, as though the coin in their pockets had put new starch into their spines. Gareth, of all people, found me near the practice yard on that first payday. He was grinning like a much younger man, turning coppers over and over in his palm. He was doing arithmetic, plainly, on what a month of guard wages at the new rate would buy him. Free food had never once made him grateful. A wage that, more than anything Ball or I said to each other across that desk, was the whole argument settled. Winter loosened its grip slowly, the way old debts do, a little each week and never all at once. It was somewhere in that grudging thaw that Ella came through my study door without knocking. A basket sat balanced on her hip, and her face was lit up like she had personally reinvented spring. Inside the basket, vegetables. Actual fresh green vegetables grown in the dead of winter. The underground greenhouses I had built over the old heating vents made it possible. Coal-warmed soil doing in weeks what open fields wouldn't manage until late April. She talked fast. The composting mix, the heat distribution, how much faster the second planting had come up than the first. I let her finish, because her excitement was, in its own way, useful data. My mind had already left the vegetables behind and gone somewhere considerably less sentimental. Deep winter, this far north, meant one very predictable thing happening in every noble household in Red Leaf City. No fresh greens for months on end. And eventually, bleeding gums, sores that wouldn't close, the slow rot of scurvy working through people too proud to admit a diet of salted meat had finally caught up with them. I told Ella none of the vegetables were going to the town kitchens. Not yet. Instead, I had Mars pack them into insulated crates and ride them straight to Red Leaf City. He would sell them under a story he and I built together on the spot. Not vegetables at all, but the leaf of life, a rare harvest pulled from deep inside an elf forest, priced like the miracle it was pretending to be. Ella called me a shameless capitalist to my face. Given the basket still in her arms and the crates already loading outside, that was difficult to argue with. I didn't try. I told her I was using noble greed as a funding source for everything Greywood still needed to become. The people eating cabbage off silver plates in Red Leaf City would never miss the coin half as much as my town needed it. That morning's count came in at 8,521. Alongside it, a system notice in its usual bloodless tone informed me that the wage economy had lifted territory productivity by 50%. I stood at the window a long while after reading it, watching the first real drip of meltwater slide off the eaves. Winter, for all practical purposes, was beaten. A man who has just survived winter with 50% more productivity than he started with does not think about resting. He thinks about how much further the thaw will let him walk. In Red Leaf City, Victor opened the crate himself, apparently, right there in the receiving hall. He stood for a long moment doing nothing but looking at green things in a season that shouldn't have produced any. Only then did Mars lean in and name the actual price. Not gold. Victor had gold already. Every noble house in that city had gold gathering dust in cellars they didn't need filled any further. What I wanted, Mars told him, was people. 100 of them specifically. Smiths, carpenters, weavers, the trained hands Red Leaf had in surplus in Greywood didn't have nearly enough of. Back home, Baal brought me the same objection Victor had apparently raised, just phrased for a smaller audience. He asked why I would trade something as valuable as fresh food for what he called useless mouths, when I could simply have taken the gold and let the recipients feed themselves. I sat him down and explained it the way I actually thought it, because there wasn't much reason to dress it up for him. Gold is a promise that depends entirely on the goodwill of whoever is selling. Red Leaf could close its roads to me on a whim, and every coin I had stockpiled would sit there uselessly while my people starved. Gold can be embargoed. Gold can be devalued. Gold, in the end, is only Red Leaf's opinion of itself printed on metal. People are different. Every person who registers inside my walls generates a silver coin a day from the moment they arrive until the moment they don't. Forever, whether they mine coal or lie in bed sick for a month. Nobody can blockade a citizen. Nobody can cut off my supply of them once they are inside my gates and counted. Trading vegetables, which rot, which run out, which I can grow more of in a month, for permanent, renewable income was not a hard decision. It was the only sane one available to me. I told him to take the same offer to Black Iron Territory and Storm Fortress next. Expand the trade wherever a lord sat on serfs he didn't value properly. And I set a target, 10,000 citizens before the ground fully thawed. One condition attached itself to that target. I wanted able-bodied young adults and trained hands, not the old or the sick. A charity I am not. Whatever Baal privately believes about me these days. The assassin came at night, dressed like any other serf shuffling in with a delivery cart. He made it further into the grounds than I like to admit. An orc guard on the Lord's Hall caught something wrong in the way he was moving. Some hitch in his gait that didn't match a tired laborer, and put him down before he reached my door. They found the poisoned dagger on the body afterward, still sheathed, never drawn. I stood over the corpse the next morning and felt something I hadn't accounted for in any of my projections. For all the coin, the walls, the guards, the furnaces, I was still one man, made of the same amount of skin and blood as anyone else. One lucky knife in a dark hallway could end every plan I had at once. That thought moved me into the practice yard faster than pride ever could have. I told Gareth plainly I had no interest in learning to fence with honor, parry with elegance, or die well. I wanted to survive, and those are different skills entirely, sometimes opposite ones. What we built instead, a miniature repeating crossbow strapped along my forearm under my sleeve, loaded with bolts dipped in something that wouldn't need a second shot. A dagger, sheathed against my outer thigh, positioned for exactly one kind of strike, low and ungentlemanly and extremely effective. I gave my guards a standing order that overrode every instinct they had about defending a noble properly. If assassins ever came again, the first move was blinding powder thrown wide. The second was dragging me bodily into the middle of the orc laborers. Nobody sane starts a fight in the middle of 100 armed orcs to reach one soft merchant lord. Standing and fighting is for men who have already lost the argument about staying alive. I also had Grom start running me through conditioning most mornings, hauling weighted sacks across the yard, sprinting until my lungs burned and my legs shook under me. Somewhere around the second week I admitted to myself that I didn't need to become a swordsman at all. I only needed to run faster and longer than whoever came for me next. Spring planting arrived alongside the new serfs, more than 1,000 of them walking in over the space of a few weeks from the vegetable trades. Among them was a young man named Hans, who had spent his whole life on a red leaf farm turning soil behind a pair of oxen that moved like the world owed them nothing in particular. He stood at the edge of the eastern field on the first morning of plowing season. For a long stretch he did not manage to say anything at all. What tore through the frozen ground in front of him wasn't oxen. It was iron. Plates of it, bolted into plows weighing well over 200 kilograms, hitched not to animals but to orc laborers harnessed in teams. They hauled the blades forward at a dead run. Ground that would have taken his family the better part of a week to break by hand turned to loose black furrows in minutes. The orcs never slowed. They never needed water. They never once complained about the pace. Hans looked at the man standing next to him, another new arrival wearing the same slack, disbelieving expression. Neither of them had a word ready for what they were watching. They had come from a territory of oxen, calloused hands, and winters that took whoever they wanted. They had walked, without quite understanding it yet, into something that ran on entirely different rules. It would take longer than one morning of watching iron plows tear the earth for either of them to work out exactly what those rules were. It would take longer still to work out what it would cost to live inside them. The rumors, when I finally pieced them together weeks later, came from two sources. Some of it was things Sylvie let slip without meaning to. The rest was things Mars contacts dug up on their own, piece by piece. Put together, the story went like this. House Bohemia had been erased from the political map 5 months before I ever set foot in Greywood. It was gutted in a purge orchestrated by Duke Golden Lion, a man who wanted our river holdings. He decided the fastest way to get them was to accuse my father of treason. He accused, and then he let the accusation do the rest of the work for him. That is how rot works once the first board gives, quietly, without needing a second push. My mother and my older brother survived that purge by doing nothing at all. They kept their heads down. They said nothing in any court that mattered. They let the family name sink without raising a hand to slow it. They assumed exile meant a slow death in some border ditch for the son who had been sent away. They had not spent a single coin confirming that assumption. They had not spent a single thought on it either. My sister Serena assumed nothing. That was the whole difference between her and the rest of them. She sent people to check. When reports reached her of a disgraced younger brother somehow generating whispers of fortune in a backwater barony, she did not read it as good news. She read it as a target freshly painted on my back. Golden Lion's spies had read the same reports she had. They drew a conclusion that was wrong but dangerous anyway. A supposedly dead family, they decided, was quietly bankrolling a comeback through me. So Serena emptied her own private accounts without telling anyone why. She sent her most trusted knight north. Her name was Sylvie, silver-haired tier 3 with a blade. She rode with 2 instructions burned into her the way a brand burns into hide. Find him. Do not let anyone finish what the purge started. I did not know one word of this the morning Gareth walked her through my gate at Spear Point. Dust caked the hem of her travel cloak. Dried blood, several days old by the color of it, still crusted one sleeve. She had fought her way through hired interceptors twice on the road north, according to the report I got afterward. Ambushed once in a river gorge. Ambushed again on an open stretch of trade road where there should have been nothing waiting for her at all. She had expected, by her own later account, to walk into a shack, or a labor camp, or a grave with my name on a marker beside it. Instead, she walked through a palisade lined with steel-armed guards standing rotation, a wall that had not existed one season earlier. Past the gate, orcs the size of draft horses hauled plow blades through black soil at a pace no ox team on this continent could match. Behind all of it, smoke climbed off a foundry that had no business existing this far from any real city. The smell of it reached her before the sight of it did, hot iron and coal smoke on the wind. I watched her expression do something complicated while Gareth patted her down. He was searching for weapons she had already surrendered twice at 2 separate checkpoints. An elite tier 3 sword delivered to my own front door, loyal to a sister who apparently still counted me among the living. I ran the number in my head before I even bothered asking her name. Bodyguards of that caliber cost fortunes I did not yet have sitting in any ledger of mine. Here one was anyway, free of charge. She was sent north by the one member of my bloodline who had not already written me off as a rounding error in some inheritance dispute. I told her, half joking, that she could stay on as my personal guard. I added, in the same breath, that she was under no circumstances to draw steel without my say-so first. Her jaw tightened like I had insulted the sword itself rather than her. For a moment I actually thought she might turn around and walk straight back out through the gate she had bled 3 times to reach. She did not turn around. Instead, she delivered the warning she had crossed 3 baronies to give me. Her voice stayed level even though the news wasn't. Golden Lion had leaned on Red Leaf and 3 other neighboring lords. He was pressuring all of them to strangle Greywood from every direction at once. No grain in. No salt in. No pig iron in. No refugees allowed through any border crossing that fed my town, not one, not even by the back roads. The plan, as she laid it out, was simple in the ugly way these things usually are. Starve the place. Let hunger do the rioting for you. Then send men in bandit colors to finish off whatever the famine left standing. Dressed as bandits, no court in any kingdom would ever trace the ash back to a duke's own signature. She told me to abandon the town that night. She wanted me to come with her to some hidden stronghold Serena kept in reserve for exactly this kind of collapse. She said it as if Greywood were a coat I could take off and leave folded on a chair. I almost laughed in her face. I suspect she noticed, because the fury in her expression sharpened into something closer to disbelief than anger. An embargo, I told her, assumes I still need what they are selling. My greenhouses would have winter wheat ready inside weeks regardless of season, no matter what the calendar outside said the weather should be doing. My own coal-fired furnaces turned ore into steel without touching a single ounce of Redleaf's pig iron, not now and not for months. I had men already boiling brine down into salt before Sylvie had even finished her sentence about starvation as a strategy. Cutting off my supply lines, I said, was like threatening to unplug a lamp that ran on its own generator the whole time. So I told her the real plan. I watched her brace for something clever and defensive. What she got instead was something closer to an act of aggression dressed up in the plain clothes of commerce. I intended to flood Redleaf's own markets with steel hoes and sickles priced so far below cost that no blacksmith anywhere in that barony could compete and survive it. Undercut them long enough, and every smith on Redleaf's soil goes under one at a time. Every serf's coin, every knight's coin purse funnels straight into mine instead, quietly, without a single arrow loosed. No siege engines. No breach in any wall, no ladder against any battlement. Just a slow, deliberate draining of an entire economy until it folds in on itself from the inside. It would collapse the way a barn does once enough of the support beams have quietly rotted through. Sylvie stared at me like she was recalculating everything the rumor mill back home had ever told her about the useless spare hair of House Bohemia. She recovered fast, though. She reminded me that markets take seasons to collapse, while a knife in the dark takes one night. She was not wrong to point it out. She had already felt 3 presences inside my walls that evening, well hidden, well trained. They moved like Tier 2 professionals at minimum, and quite possibly better than that. My first reaction was not fear. My first reaction, and I am not proud of how quickly it arrived, was about labor. Skilled assassins, captured rather than killed, come with superhuman physical conditioning already trained into their bodies from years of use. Free labor of that quality does not grow on trees, not even the metaphorical kind that grows the money I actually care about. The 3 of them called themselves Shadowblade. 2 were Tier 2, 1 was Tier 3. All 3 were contracted with Red Leaf coin to slip into a coal briquette warehouse, where their intelligence swore I slept beside my newest machinery. They found a bed in the dark, exactly where they expected one. They put steel into it without a moment's hesitation, 3 blades in near-perfect unison. The scarecrow underneath, stuffed with scrap iron to fool a probing edge, gave a very unsatisfying lack of a death rattle in return. I was not in that bed. I was up in the rafters above it, flat against a beam. I was holding a device my blacksmiths had built to my own specifications out of lime, magnesium shavings, and coal-derived powders. My palms were damp against the casing. My heartbeat sounded louder in my own ears than the footsteps below me. Sylvie had proposed meeting 3 trained killers with an honorable blade fight. The idea struck me as the single worst use of my own limited combat training I could possibly imagine. I lit the fuse and looked away deliberately before it went off. I had tested this thing exactly once, and I did not care to test my own eyesight against it twice. The flash swallowed the warehouse whole in an instant of pure white. It was bright enough that I saw the outline of it, even through closed eyes and a turned head. The crack that came with it left all 3 assassins clawing at their own faces, blind and half-deaf inside the space of a single heartbeat. Gareth's crossbow squad came through the side doors on that exact cue, aiming low the way I had drilled into every one of them for weeks. Legs never center mass. A corpse pays no dividends, and a captured expert eventually does, one way or another. 2 Tier 2 assassins went down screaming, bolts through their thighs, before they could even orient themselves toward the sound of the doors. The Tier 3 got further than the other 2, blind fighting on instinct alone. He cut air in wide arcs that found nothing. Gareth himself closed the distance and put a blade through the back of his ankle, severing the tendon clean in one motion. We shackled him where he fell, still blinking against a flash that had already faded. Within the week he was down in the mine shafts alongside the orcs, swinging a pick instead of a knife. It felt to me like the exact correct allocation of a resource that had tried and failed to kill me, nothing more sentimental than that. Sylvie watched the whole operation unfold from a shadowed doorway, arms crossed, saying nothing until it was over. Her expression afterward was not gratitude, not even close to it. It was the look of someone recalculating, in real time, just how dishonorable a man could be while still winning decisively. I ordered the assassin's weapons melted down the next morning instead of preserved as evidence. That decision seemed to confuse her more than the flashbang had. I explained it the way I explain most things to myself first, out loud, so I can hear whether the reasoning holds. I am not strong enough yet to survive Red Leaf and 4 allied barons in open war, not by any measure I trust. So I cannot hand any of them a legitimate pretext to start one. Real revenge, as I understand it, is not a public accusation shouted across some noble's court for an audience. It is a wound the enemy does not feel until they are already bleeding out from it. So instead of trophies, and instead of proof to wave in front of a magistrate, I redirected every furnace and every smith in Greywood. Military steel could wait. What I wanted was Red Leaf's own civilian markets flooded with hoes, pots, nails, and sickles priced to bankrupt every competitor within reach. I also had Mars quietly deliver a batch of discounted steel goods straight to Victor's castle. It was framed as a gesture of gratitude for the protection agreement between us. That framing was true, in the sense that gratitude is a currency I am always willing to spend if it buys future dependency in return. Get the commoners hooked on cheap Greywood steel first. Get the nobility hooked on it soon after. Red Leaf stops being a threat and starts being a customer, whether Victor himself ever notices the shift happening under him or not. I was feeling rather pleased with myself about all of it, right up until the system delivered something it had never delivered before. Population crossed 10,025 that week. Instead of the usual clean tally climbing upward the way it always had, a new line appeared underneath it. It was one I had never seen before in any report. A management chaos penalty sat there in plain lettering as if it had always belonged. It docked 15% off my daily silver income for administrative disorder. I stared at that number for longer than I care to admit. In all my time running this ledger, the total had only ever gone up. Something in my chest went tight and cold. It was the particular kind of unease that has nothing to do with fear of a blade, and everything to do with fear of a spreadsheet. It took me exactly as long as it took to walk the length of the granary and back to understand the actual problem underneath the number. I had thousands of serfs now, dozens of guard officers, and a growing list of mine supervisors. The overwhelming majority of every one of them could not read a written order. Most of them could not add 2 sums without counting it out on their fingers first. A territory this size cannot run on verbal instructions relayed by word of mouth down a chain of exhausted, illiterate men. Not for long, and not without cracks opening somewhere in that chain. The fix was obvious to me and apparently unthinkable to nearly everyone else around me. Literacy in this world is something the nobility and the church guard jealously. The punishments for it run up to and including cutting out the tongue of any commoner caught teaching themselves letters in secret. I decreed mandatory night classes anyway, for every production team leader, every guard officer, and every mine supervisor under my banner. I built real teeth into the decree. A policy without consequences is just a suggestion wearing a uniform. Fail to progress, and your pay gets docked. Fail again, and you get rotated back onto manual coal hauling until you improve enough to earn the desk back. Ella took charge of the arithmetic and the numeral system. She taught grown men to count in a script simpler than the one most of them had spent a lifetime avoiding entirely. Sylvie, once she had stopped glaring at me long enough to be useful, drilled the officers through a command manual I had written myself, page by page. Formations and supply orders stopped depending on any one man's memory once that manual took hold. I stood outside the schoolhouse window one night and watched grown foremen mouth numbers under their breath like children sounding out a first word. Something in my chest that almost resembled warmth showed up uninvited. I let it sit there a while before I examined it. I want to be honest about what that warmth actually was, because I do not trust myself to be honest about it twice if I let the memory soften with time. I have no interest in enlightening anyone for its own sake. What I want is foremen who can read a shipment order without 3 relay men garbling it somewhere down the line. What I want is officers who can execute a written command without me standing over their shoulder to confirm it. What I want is supervisors who can do sums fast enough that my chaos penalty disappears and my daily silver climbs the way it is supposed to climb. Every lesson taught in that schoolhouse is an investment with a projected return, nothing more mysterious than that. If the byproduct happens to be a few hundred serfs, who can now read their own names for the first time in their lives, that is a rounding error I can live with comfortably. Which brings me to tonight, standing at my window with all of it laid out at once in my head, and none of it resolved. The embargo Golden Lion strong arm together takes full effect within days. Grain, salt, and iron shipments from every direction get cut off almost simultaneously. It happens all at once, the way a noose tightens on every side at the same instant rather than one. No matter how confident I am in my greenhouses and my furnaces, I have never actually run a barony through a siege of this shape before. Confidence on paper is not the same thing as confidence tested. Sylvie made a point of telling me, flatly, without any of her earlier fury left in her voice, that something mattered more than the assassins we had already dealt with. The 3 Shadowblade assassins we caught and put to work in the mines were a probe and nothing more, in her account of it. A cheap first test, she called it, meant only to see how I would react, not the real attempt at all. A duke who orchestrated the fall of an entire noble house, she reminded me, is not a man who stops after one failure and walks away satisfied. I have built my confidence in this war on numbers I understand. Cost curves. Market saturation. The slow bleed of an enemy's economy from the inside, drop by drop, until the whole structure gives out under its own weight. But numbers do not tell me what a man like Golden Lion does next when his first move fails and his target refuses to collapse on schedule. Numbers cannot tell me whether the next blade waiting in the dark will come for my throat instead of an empty scarecrow bed. Numbers cannot tell me whether the next messenger through my gate will be carrying grain or carrying poison. Sitting here in the dark with that embargo bearing down on the horizon, I keep turning the same thought over without ever wearing it smooth. 3 more moves sit somewhere in his hand, unplayed and unseen, waiting for whatever moment suits him best. I have no way to see the shape of any of them before they land. The candle on my desk has burned down to a stub, and I have not bothered to replace it. Sitting in the near dark seems to suit the size of the question in front of me better than any light would. Outside, the foundry fires are still going. Somewhere below them a whole town is sleeping on the assumption that I have already worked out how to protect it. I have not. I have a ledger full of numbers I trust, and a war I understand only in the shape of markets and grain stores and steel prices. None of that tells me what a cornered, humiliated duke does with his next move. So I have to admit something plainly, if only to myself and to no one else in this room. There is no one left awake to hear it, and no version of the sentence that sounds better dressed up in confidence I do not actually have tonight. I genuinely do not know what he is going to try next to make sure I never get the chance to prove any of this works.